as the designee of the Minority Leader.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Today I join my colleagues in calling for an immediate vote on disaster funding. In 2018 and so far in 2019, we've witnessed devastating disasters with hurricanes hitting Florida, Georgia, Alabama, and the Carolinas, wildfires in California, flooding in the Midwest, an earthquake in Alaska, and several other widespread weather events that have harmed communities across our country and our territories. The people in our districts and states need our help, and it is our duty to fight for them. I thank my colleagues for joining me today, and I yield 3 minutes to the gentlewoman from southern Alabama whose district abuts my district, joins my district, Congressman Martha Roby.
Well, I thank the gentleman from Florida for leading this very important conversation here tonight. And I want to thank all of my colleagues from our neighboring states and across this country for keeping this issue in the forefront of the American people's minds. Over the last several months, Americans in many corners of this country have experienced devastating loss of life, property, and livelihood because of wildfires, flooding, and severe storms. I'm here tonight to express my strong support for the many Alabamians, both in the 2nd District and in our neighboring Lee County, who have been badly impacted by severe weather. Last October, areas of the Wiregrass region in Alabama's 2nd District were ravaged when Hurricane Michael made landfall. Barber, Dale, Henry, Geneva, and Houston counties were the most severely impacted. Throughout the Southeast, people lost their loved ones and their homes, and our farmers were dealt a devastating blow during the middle of harvest. This unprecedented disaster resulted in a tremendous economic setback for our agricultural community and our state. Last month, our neighbors in Lee County faced extreme devastation when tornadoes touched down. Many were killed and many homes were lost and destroyed. Mr. Speaker, Madam Speaker, we are here tonight because these people need help. Here in Congress, it is our responsibility to make disaster recovery funds available now. I implore my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to stop playing political games with disaster funding. By politicizing this humanitarian issue, we are playing politics with people's lives. We must immediately advance common sense, nonpartisan disaster assistance for the people who have been hit hardest and are struggling to recover. I am hopeful that alongside my colleagues on both sides of the aisle that a solution will be reached soon. Many Alabamians, many Americans are depending on it. And again, thank you to the gentleman from Florida for leading this discussion, and I yield back to you.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. I want to wish my gratitude to Martha Roby for her speech and for her sentiments on her people in Alabama. And next, I'd like to introduce and yield time to 5 minutes time to my good friend Austin Scott, who has been one of the champions for the Disaster Supplemental Fund. He has worked tirelessly for the last 7 months to advance this effort. I yield 5 minutes to Representative Austin Scott.
I want to thank my colleague, Mr. Dunn, for leading this effort. I know his district was hit probably harder than any other district in the United States. Madam Speaker, I rise today alongside many of my fellow colleagues to again stress the hardship many of our fellow Americans face following the devastating natural disasters of 2018. On October 10th, 2018, Hurricane Michael entered my home state of Georgia as a Category 3 storm. With it, we saw widespread damage from dangerous winds, flooding, and torrential rains. Hurricane Michael traced a path of destruction through south and middle Georgia, straddling both mine and Congressman Sanford Bishop's districts. Our districts are largely rural areas that have also been hit hard by tornadoes and flooding in recent years. These areas are key to the state's agricultural sector, which is Georgia's #1 industry. Madam Speaker, the American farmer is the backbone of agriculture. Agriculture is Georgia's #1 industry. Fearing the worst of this storm, many farmers began harvesting what they could as Hurricane Michael crept closer and closer to Georgia. It was the best yields we'd seen in years for what was gathered before the storm hit. And after years of low commodity prices, unfair trade practices, labor shortages, and consecutive years of devastating storms, we needed it. Once Hurricane Michael hit, it was all gone. Not only did we lose billions of dollars in commodity crops like cotton and peanuts, but we lost orchards and forests that will take decades to regrow. Since the day after the storm, I worked side by side with my friend and colleague, Congressman Bishop, in an effort to bring our communities impacted by Hurricane Michael the tools they need to recover and rebuild. At every turn, we've worked together to bring attention to the crisis and to bring relief to these farmers, alongside our other colleagues that have been impacted. The President and the Vice President personally came down and promised help. I was there. For months, we've stressed the magnitude of the damage to our colleagues, and for months, we've promised this was a priority for the White House and congressional leadership from both sides of the aisle. Any bill to fund the government will have disaster relief. I don't know how many times I've heard it. I can't name all the people I heard it from. And as we stand here today, 6 months later, these can only be called empty promises. Never before have we seen American communities that were wrecked with the catastrophes neglected like this. Now, to this day, OMB hasn't even submitted a request for disaster assistance. Calls to White House staff have gone unheeded, and but for one tweet on April 1st, it seems the President has moved on. For months, I've received calls from farmers and the lenders they rely on that the financial impact of Hurricane Michael were becoming increasingly more difficult to bear. And then last week, the Senate showed how truly ugly and partisan politics have become, voting down a measure that would have brought billions in federal relief that communities in my home state of Georgia and around the country desperately need to get back on their feet again. Money to rebuild infrastructure and restore services, as well as farm aid. Certainly no one would have stood in the way of disaster relief for states like Vermont or New York. But rural Americans, we've been forgotten. We were forgotten again last week in the Senate's failure to pass disaster assistance. Well, rural Americans are Americans too, whether the press likes it or not, and whether certain members of the Senate like it or not. And they need our help to rebuild. And if the Senate cannot pass a bill to provide this federal disaster assistance, the bottom line is farm bankruptcies will continue. And I fear that the community banks and the businesses that support the farm sector will too. The truth is, if Hurricane Michael had hit Americans who weren't farmers, or farmers who aren't Americans, the stories of Washington's apathy to get things done would be the front page of every paper. Well, Mr. Speaker, the American farmers work day in and day out to feed and clothe America and the world. I urge the White House and the Congress to reverse their course of abandoning our farmers and keep the promises that you made to them. Madam Speaker, I yield the remainder of my time.
Madam Speaker, I thank my good friend Austin Scott for his words. He has truly been at the forefront of the fight for this disaster supplemental since day one. And now I would like to yield 2 minutes to my good friend and classmate, the representative from Omaha, Nebraska, General Don Bacon.
Thank you, Mr. Dunn, and thank you, Madam Speaker. I rise today to advocate in support of a disaster assistance package from recent floods, storms, fires. Last month, my district and the home state of Nebraska was hit by devastating flooding, destroying more than 2,000 homes, 340 businesses, and taking several lives, making it the worst natural disaster to hit our state in a 152-year history. Many families and communities in my district have been severely impacted. For several days in March, the only way in and out of Valley and Waterloo, 2 towns in our district, was either by boat or helicopter. And next door to our district, 1/3 of Offutt Air Force Base was underwater, to include 60 structures. The economic impact has been severe and will hurt the state of Nebraska for years to come. Current estimates reveal that the cost of the damage will surpass $1.3 billion to $1.4 billion. This includes $449 million in damaged roads, levees, and other infrastructure. Currently, 200 miles of Nebraska roads are in need of repair. What once was a short drive of minutes, in some cases may now take hours, disrupting everyday commerce and travel. The Nebraska Department of Agriculture estimates that the March floods will have $400 million in losses for livestock, $36 million in livestock feed loss, $440 million worth of potential crop loss from delayed and prevented planting. Nebraskans are a strong and a resilient people, but they need to know that we are with them and will help them through these difficult times. Now, while Nebraska's been experiencing these horrible floods, I take solace in our first responders and National Guard. I cannot thank these brave men and women enough for helping so many in our community. In many small communities across Nebraska, first responders they volunteer, they're rushing out to help others, while their own homes were in peril. These heroes selfishly saved countless lives and property. I want to give a shout out to the Waterloo Fire Department, volunteers, and I saw them 3 times. They rescued nearly 200 people as volunteers over a course of a week. And I think of the Salvation Army leader who ran the collection center, working countless hours while his own home was underwater. In these trying times, I urge my colleagues to put politics aside, come together to help Nebraska and other Americans hurting from these national disasters that have occurred over this past year. We are Nebraska strong, but we do need that federal support. So I thank you, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Madam Speaker, I thank General Bacon for his words, and now also from Nebraska, we have a true leader of the House and a good friend. I yield 7 minutes to Representative Fortenberry.
Thank you, Dr. Dunn, for hosting this very important discussion. And as we have visited on several different occasions, I want to publicly commend you for your dedication, for fighting for the right thing to do, for your deep compassion for the people that you represent, and the tireless effort that you're making to explain the consequences of Hurricane Michael as it hit you, the floods that have hit us, the wildfires that have hit others. Thank you so much for the time and for your leadership. Madam Speaker, when spring approaches Nebraska, we expect our rivers and streams to peacefully rise as snow from the nearby Rockies gently melts. We are the Cornhusker State, but we actually could be called the River State, and here's why. We have more miles of rivers than any other state in the Union. The Missouri, the Platte, the Republican, the Elkhorn, and Niobrara are our most famous rivers, but we really don't think of them as threatening until they are. So, as General Bacon just said, this was the most destructive storm in most Nebraskans' lifetimes. A perfect storm of factors caused the pain and destruction now all around us. Lands that were soaked from earlier autumn rains were frozen solid, then covered in snow. When the bomb cyclone's lethal mix of blizzard and rain then hit our state, an enormous quantity of water and ice and collected topsoil sped down the hard land like a furious slurry into the rivers and creeks and reservoirs, and it burst through dams and levees and other structures that normally would hold this back. Madam Speaker, it is pretty hard to get the mind around what a 500-year event actually means. But as I was standing at the ridge on Offutt Air Force Base, which is located right south of Omaha near the confluence of the Platte and Missouri rivers, I could see how the unprecedented force of water covered a third of that entire base and many communities in eastern Nebraska. As the rushing water hit the bank on the other side of the river, on the Iowa side, it blew it out and created a 62-foot deep hole. As a member of the Appropriations Committee here in Congress, I turned to the commander of the Corps of Engineers who was with me, and I looked at him and I said, "What's the number?" He immediately shot back without hesitation and said, "It's going to be a lot." Now, a little bit down the road to the west is the town of Fremont, and Mayor Scotty Getchman, a dedicated local public service servant who's in the heating and air conditioning business as his main job. He brought out a 1940 map of the old river channel of the Platte River. The problem for this town of Fremont began when the river got a bit nostalgic and sought to its old ways. In a place now named Ground Zero near the Rod and Gun Club west of town, massive chunks of ice and the pressure of the Platte blew the levee. Water began to find its own channels and multiple breaches, and the southern part of that town, Fremont, endured serious flooding. We surveyed the damage from a freshly patched hole, from remnants of an old hog confinement lot. That's recycling at its highest, and the old Scribner Air Base. An initial call for help in the community brought 250 people out. Shortly thereafter, 1,000 people showed up to sandbag. One man moved his car to higher ground because he could see what was coming, but then it was later swept away by the raging river. And he spent the next few days at the intersection directing traffic as a volunteer. Madam Speaker, a bit west of this town of Fremont is the small town of North Bend, and that's where a ditch dike could not contain itself and made its own channel, creating fingers of water flowing throughout the city. And the vast majority of homes in this small community were hit. The paved streets looked like mud streets by the time I got there, but even with 6 inches of water inside of it, the North Bend Eagle, the local newspaper, figured out a way to get that addition out. Realizing that he was in a critical spot, the North Bend school superintendent transformed the entire school, really one of the newer buildings, into a center of gravity for emergency operations. And though school was canceled, it didn't mean the kids weren't busy. Initially, they sandbagged. Then they began to volunteer for days on end with the cleanup effort. The people of North Bend organized themselves, and word spread. Goods poured in from all over the country. And as the superintendent told me, he said, what was happening there could make a good country song. They would have so much appreciation for Nebraska. Areas south of Columbus, the town of Columbus, a little bit further to the west, were also particularly hard hit with very large ag and mounting ag losses, the most visible sign of which were dead cattle. In fact, this past Saturday, I went to a high school fundraiser in Columbus, and along Highway 81, the speed signs were still bent over like this with grass attached to them, showing the magnitude and the volume of water that rushed over that area. There's a truck stop there named T-Bones, Madam Speaker, and it greets passersby with 2 enormous cowboy boots on poles embedded in concrete. One was found 300 yards away at Matulka's garage. The other one was across the highway about a half a mile away. They'll probably be put back up to greet passersby once again. By the time, again, I got there, the 4 feet of mud and water had receded, and a lot had been cleaned up. I looked at Fred. I said, how'd this happen? He said, this is T-Bones. We don't mess around. We're Nebraskans. We get things done. On a more positive note, Madam Speaker, a federal project initiated after the last flood of 2011 saved the little town of Schuyler, Nebraska, and a couple of other things positively have happened. Nebraska's congressional delegation asked for expedited assistance, and the President granted it, emergency disaster, or designation of federal emergency disaster. Even in the midst of this trauma, but Nebraskans found a way to get a few laughs. Again, along the fence across from that truck stop of T-Bones, there was a hand-painted sign that said, "Mud Wrestling Tomorrow." Back at Offutt Air Force Base, it's a pretty jarring scene when you see a large fuel tank lifted up and turned on its side. It shows you the powerful force of this water. As many of you have, many of the Congress members who have experienced this have had the same outpouring of support from family and friends around the country. I wanted to tell you just a quick few things that happened to me. A nun from Rome wrote to me and offered her prayers. A congressman from another area of the country texted me and said, I'll send my staff, whatever you need. The Jordanian ambassador to the United States contacted me with her concerns. Madam Speaker, as you and I have seen firsthand, a natural disaster can create certain blessings in disguise. It's a time when we can come together and put aside any political differences and lend a helping hand to our fellow citizens. And I think that's exactly what America wants Congress to do right now. Put our differences aside, find consensus, quickly pass a supplemental to simply help my constituents and the others who have been so devastated by these unpredictable, unforeseen events. Many have waited and waited, and I think this is the time. I yield back to the gentleman. Thanks so much.
Madam Speaker, I thank Representative Fortenberry for his compelling description of the damages that were suffered in Nebraska and also of the response of those brave people. Yeah. And now I would like to yield 3 minutes to my good friend and one of the most outstanding members of the new class here in Congress, a representative from Virginia, Representative Denver Riggleman.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and thank you, Congressman Dunn. And to my colleagues, I rise in support of them and the incredible work they've done for disaster relief. And I also rise today to speak about my district, the 5th District of Virginia, which borders North Carolina, which was devastated last year by 2 hurricanes, first Florence and then Michael. The damage was immense, and the impact on families was tragic, including the loss of lives. This is not an issue I take lightly. In fact, I pledged to make a donation to Drake's Branch Volunteer Fire Department in Charlotte County, which was an area the hurricanes hit particularly hard. Actually, the collapse of the volunteer fire station back into the river, and the fact is they had nowhere to actually do fire emergency work. Applications for FEMA aid were filed in Charlotte County, Danville City, Franklin County, Halifax County, Lunenburg County, Mecklenburg County, and Prince Edward County, and many additional counties in my district were affected by these hurricanes. Unfortunately, the effects were not limited to my district, and the lasting damage done by these storms lingers in these communities today. Yes, they are rebuilding and recovering, but we cannot ignore the opportunity to prevent this from happening again. There are other things we can do, not only with disaster relief and supplementals, but also working on issues like I am in financial services by addressing issues in the National Flood Insurance Program. The NFIP is a necessary federal backstop for flood insurance, but substantially increasing private participation will help Americans better prepare for potential future flood emergencies. I would also like to take this time to commend the great work done by so many emergency responders and volunteers who helped the communities of the 5th District and throughout the other states and in my colleagues' districts, helped them dig out and move forward after these hurricanes. I have visited with many of these brave men and women who put themselves at risk to help their communities. I commend the strong folks that make up all of these communities, linked not only by hurricanes, but by their ability to move on with great resilience. And with that, I yield the remainder of my time.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I would like to thank Representative Riggleman for his words, and I know that his constituents are fortunate to have a man of his rare abilities serving them at all times. And now I'd like to yield time, 3 minutes, to another member, outstanding member of the freshman class from South Dakota, Representative Dusty Johnson.
Thank you very much, sir, and thank you, Madam Speaker. I'm honored to be a part of this special order tonight, and I want to highlight the dire situation in my home state of South Dakota. Our state is just barely beginning to recover from dramatic flooding, while simultaneously we're trying to prepare for the disaster to get worse. As a blizzard this week will dump freezing rain and more than a foot of snow onto already saturated ground. Now, I know I've heard colleagues talk about similar and in some cases even more dramatic damage to their homes. And we've seen in their states and in mine, we've seen commerce interrupted. We've seen livelihoods devastated. We've seen cattle killed, and worse yet, we've seen human life lost. Now, within South Dakota, there have been many impacted communities, although perhaps none more dramatically than Indian Country. When I've talked to President Bear Runner, Pine Ridge, or President Bordeaux, Rosebud, or Chairman Frazier from Cheyenne River, their texts, their phone calls, our face-to-face meetings, they are heavy with the frustration and the exhaustion, the irritation, the concern about what's going on for their people. Madam Speaker, put more appropriately, their concern for what's going on with our people. I just came, right before I walked onto the floor here, I came from a meeting with Chairman Harold Frazier. And he had picture after picture after picture, Madam Speaker, of the devastation there at Cheyenne River. I mean, cemeteries underwater, roads underwater, cattle underwater, cars underwater. I know South Dakota is not the only community that is impacted. Many of us need a helping hand. Many of the people in our states are too proud to ask for a helping hand. But tonight I would just ask my colleagues in this body and my colleagues in the Senate to do everything they can to put politics aside and to pass a disaster relief bill that can do much needed work for our country. Thank you, and I yield back.
Madam Speaker, I thank Representative Johnson for his description, his words, and also for his granular knowledge of his district. I know that that's a benefit to everybody there. Now I'd like to yield 4 minutes to my good friend from Florida, he whose district abuts mine on the east side, Sheriff John Rutherford of Jacksonville, Florida.
Thank you. I appreciate the gentleman yielding and giving me this opportunity to speak about this very important topic impacting our state and our constituents. Madam Speaker, I rise today to strongly urge House and particularly the Senate leadership to stop turning their backs on hurricane survivors in my home state of Florida and pass a disaster supplemental bill before Congress leaves for the next 2 weeks. Last October, Hurricane Michael ravaged our state, hitting the Panhandle with speeds of up to 155 miles an hour and killing 49 people. 6 months later, six months later, families, farmers, and businesses are still waiting for the assistance that they deserve. Families lost homes, precious belongings, things that can never be replaced. Florida's timber industry was decimated. The total timber damage is an estimated 2.8 million acres of timber that is now lying, rotting on the ground. 2.8 million acres. This is unquestionably one of the worst storms to hit Florida in our long history. But not only are Florida agriculture and other industries desperately awaiting our help, our national security is also being impacted. Tyndall Air Force Base, one of the nation's premier military installations, was completely demolished by this storm. And since Congress has not passed emergency funding, the Air Force has been forced to move money from other accounts to help pay for the recovery. The Air Force is now facing even tougher choices, like limiting flying time and construction projects from other installations. Madam Speaker, this is simply unacceptable. Maybe if the Senate Democrats would spend less time focused on running for president and more time doing their job that they're elected to do, folks back home would already have the disaster relief that they are due. I voted along with my House colleagues to pass the supplemental back in December. December we passed that. The Senate Democrats have just obstructed that effort. Entire small communities that were wiped away still have no assistance coming from the federal government. I hope the hardworking taxpayers of Florida remember this lack of concern when they go to the polls in 2020. Our Senate is broken by a 60-vote cloture rule that has to be removed. And I hope the folks back home will remember this in November of 2020. With that, I yield back.
Madam Speaker, I want to thank Sheriff Rutherford for his words. He's been a stalwart ally, a great friend ever since we arrived here on day one. You were a true friend to all of Florida. Thank you so much, Representative Rutherford. Now I'd like to introduce and yield time to 4 minutes to one of the true leaders of our conference from California, Representative LaMalfa.
Well, I want to thank my colleague, Mr. Dunn, from Florida here for leading us in this special order tonight and making us this opportunity to talk about a very important aspect of our jobs together as it affects our different regions and our states across the country. So it's an important opportunity to highlight in my own district our critical need for disaster funding in California, as well as the success stories we've had in the past, but also the needs of my colleagues in the southern states, and now, unfortunately, too, in the Midwest, my colleagues from Nebraska. Unfortunately, it appears that we will head into a 2-week recess now without the Senate doing their half of the job in this Congress and sending a relief package to the House that's so desperately needed. A real shame.
This comes after the Senate Democrats rejected the latest attempts by Republicans to reach a compromise. Highlights one common trend I've seen so far in this Congress, that Democrats aren't interested in good faith negotiations with Republicans. They say all or nothing, take it or leave it. Now, we got two different houses. One has a majority of one, and the other has a majority of the other. We're going to have to come together a lot if we're going to get anything done in this Congress. What we have right now is no way to govern. Disasters take a substantial toll on many areas of the country. In my own district, in the last 2 years, for example, 2 years ago was the spillway disaster at Oroville, on the Oroville Dam. Now, with 2 years of good work, that spillway now is back functioning once again, rebuilt with a heck of a lot of money and a lot of people coordinating to get it done quickly. We just saw the last few days 25,000 CFS of water is coming over that spillway in order that the lake can be regulated safely and accurately for flood control, as well as storing water that we need through the year. Unfortunately, that isn't the last disaster in Northern California. We had 2 more on top of that. Near Redding, California, what's known as the Carr Fire, a fire-nado they labeled it, doing so much devastation on the west side there. And then ultimately in November, 2 days after the election, in Paradise, California, we've all heard about that. A whole town basically has disappeared in that fire, in that conflagration, destroying, again, thousands of homes and buildings and dozens of people lost in that. The Camp Fire and the areas around it, Concal, Magalia, they'll be recovering for quite some time. Thankfully, we've had help, and we are thankful for that. We're thankful for the funding for the Oroville Dam spillway. We're thankful for the help initially here for the Carr Fire in Redding and in the Camp Fire in Paradise. But for all the combined disasters we're looking at, Mr. Scott in Georgia, who still needs help, and my other colleagues, we have to have a stable flow into the coffers for our disaster relief that's so desperately needed all over the country. Why isn't the Senate doing its job? With all that's happened in our home state of California, why is the junior senator of California more worried about 2 years ahead of the election, spending all the time in the other 49 states campaigning, instead of showing up to vote on the relief measure when the Senate considered it last week and the House passed a version of it back in December? It appears that senator had more important things to do. I hope Californians will remember that for a lot of reasons. The Camp Fire in Paradise was the deadliest and most destructive wildfire in California history, the deadliest in our country for over 100 years. It's time for the Senate Democrats to quit fooling around with political games, get this disaster assistance in place, not just for me, but for all my colleagues around the country who have people they're responsible for and need to get the work done. We've done our job in the House. D.C. must do its job overall, Senate included. Thank you for the time.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I want to thank Representative LaValfa for his sincere words and his seasoned judgment and insights. Let us hope that those words fall on fertile ground. And now I would like to introduce one of my dearest friends in the House. We were friends for many years before we came to this House, and his talents are known to all of us. He is an Olympian among his class. Let me yield 5 minutes to Representative Matt Gaetz from Florida's District Number 1.
I thank the gentleman for yielding, and I thank Dr. Dunn for the work not only in ripening this issue, but also in crafting disaster response legislation that would work for the people impacted by Hurricane Michael. I also want to thank the gentleman from Georgia, Austin Scott. Well before others were speaking out on this issue, Dr. Dunn and Mr. Scott were working very hard to ensure that the needs of our constituents were adequately represented. Madam Speaker, disasters give us time to rise to the occasion as leaders in our community. They give us the chance to inspire people on their worst day and to ensure that those who carry the disproportionate burden of challenge will be assisted and helped by their fellow countrymen and women in the United States of America. But sadly, following Hurricane Michael, we have not, as a Congress, risen to the occasion, particularly in the Senate, where there is no movement now on legislation before a 2-week recess to address the terrible tragedy of Hurricane Michael. It is unfathomable to me that every other major storm that has hit our country named has received a disaster supplemental. And I guess the constituents that I serve, that Dr. Dunn, that Mr. Scott serve, wonder, What's so special about us? What's so different about the people of South Georgia, South Alabama, North Florida, that we would be left out? Is it that Hurricane Michael blew at less of a rate of wind? No. Is it that it dumped less rain? I guess it's just that the people impacted by Michael are unique victims of a broken system in Washington that careens from disaster to disaster itself rather than focusing on the disasters impacting our constituents. And Madam Speaker, what's so deeply tragic about this is that as folks are trying to put their lives and their schools and their families and their churches back together, we're moving into the summer lightning storm season in my community, and they're going to be victimized all over again because we got 72 million cubic tons of fuel on the ground in North Florida and South Georgia and South Alabama, and with the first lightning storms, that's going to ignite. And so as my Democrat colleagues, in a matter of a day or so, prepare for their retreat, my constituents prepare not for a retreat, but for the advance of fires that will take their homes, their lives, their farms, their livelihoods, and their hope for a brighter future. And so I beg, I plead, I implore my colleagues, let's look past the politics of this moment. Let's realize that it could be any of our districts uniquely impacted by a storm or a fire or an earthquake or some other terrible disaster. And that while on most days we wear our jerseys and suit up and compete against one another in a marketplace of ideas, let's come together as one team, as one country, and do right by those who are suffering from these terrible tragedies. Again, I thank my colleague from Florida for yielding time. I thank him for his leadership, and I yield back.
Madam Speaker, it's always a pleasure to introduce Representative Gates and hear his oratory. Thank you so much for your brilliant words, Representative Gates. And now it is my pleasure to introduce another friend from North Carolina. Representative Rouser is a friend. He has visited my home. I have visited his district. He truly knows what it's like to see other districts and empathize with them and to reach out. And I'm deeply gratified to have him here speaking today, and I yield 4 minutes to Representative Rouser.
I want to thank my colleague, Representative Neil Dunn from Florida, who's not only a great colleague but a great friend. Madam Speaker, it's not just Hurricane Michael. In my district, we had Hurricane Matthew in 2016. But it's also Hurricane Florence that devastated southeastern North Carolina and many other areas this past fall as well. A lot of my previous speakers, my colleagues who have come before me here today, have talked about the need for disaster assistance, and they're exactly right. I want to compliment what they have said, supplement what they have said, and paint a little bit broader picture here. You got to understand that agriculture in particular has faced 5 years of really, really low prices. So farmers, whether they're in North Carolina and have suffered from the flood of Hurricane Florence, or whether they're in Georgia or Florida or anywhere else and have suffered from Hurricane Michael or the floods in Nebraska, for example, they have no equity left. They've suffered 5 years of really, really low prices. We had a farm bill in place that quite honestly was not adequate in terms of the safety net that was in place. And as a result, they have no equity. And think about this. Think about all those out there, and for those who are not involved in agriculture, think about it this way. Assume that you have invested millions and millions and millions of dollars that are plowed, literally plowed into the ground, but have no opportunity to produce a crop. You have no equity left. You just took a loan out from the bank. You're highly leveraged because of 5 years of low commodity prices. You've taken that loan out. This is the 1 year that you had available to you to make up the difference, to begin to turn it around financially. And lo and behold, you get hit by Hurricane Florence, totally flooded, early September, no opportunity to harvest your crop, and there you are. That's the scenario. That's the picture. That's what so many farm families all across eastern North Carolina, all across the southeast, are facing today. Meanwhile, You've got members of the House and the Senate who care very deeply about their constituency, have been working very, very hard to get an ag disaster package, and find it incredibly frustrating that here in April, months after these storms have hit, we've made no progress. And there's a variety of reasons for that, but the fact of the matter is this chamber and the Senate chamber need to come together with the White House to get this ag disaster package done just as quickly as possible. In North Carolina, agriculture is an $87 billion industry, the largest industry by far. And let me make one final point. When these farm families are gone, when these farms are gone, they're not coming back. They're growing houses instead. They're not coming back. This agriculture disaster package is so critically important. We've got to get it done. I thank the leadership and the spirit of my good friend from Florida, Neil Dunn, and I really, really commend him and my other colleagues for putting forward the effort tonight to raise awareness of this issue. It's so critically important, not only for my home state of North Carolina, but for America. Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you, Representative David Rouzer, for those words. It's a sad story that you told, but it's a story that needed to be heard, and is one that's being lived out through many of our districts. The end of generations of farming in some families. Just a very sad story. I next want to introduce a good friend of mine from our class. He's also from Georgia. He's a great congressman. We have visited in his district, and let me say that it's been a pleasure to work with he and his wife. Representative Rick Allen for 4 minutes.
Yes. Thank you, thank you, Dr. Dunn, and thank you for your work here this evening to bring attention to something that is critical for not only our great citizens in Florida, North Florida, but of course we heard about North Carolina, Nebraska, and of course we've been waiting since last October in Georgia. You've heard about the devastation from Hurricane Michael. You know, it left a tremendous trail of destruction. It was a Category 3 storm that reached my district with winds over 100 miles per hour. We lost trees, power lines, crops, poultry, houses, and much more. You know, while traveling the district, I was able to see firsthand the heart-wrenching wreckage that Hurricane Michael left behind, and it's still there to this day, nearly 6 months later. Many of my farmers in my district are struggling to survive. I mean, we had cotton on the ground, probably the best harvest we're going to have in a long time, gone. In addition to Hurricane Michael, it's also important to highlight the need for assistance we've been working to secure for our blueberry and peach producers in the state who still suffer from losses and damaged bushes and trees resulting from late season freezes. Not a day goes by that I don't hear from a Georgia 12 farmer about the urgency of providing disaster relief funding immediately. And just last week, Senate Democrats chose to block a desperately needed bipartisan disaster relief package that would have provided critical funding to our communities, not only in Georgia, but across the nation that have been affected by these disasters. Let me just say this. Holding farmers who feed and clothe our nation hostage over partisan politics is downright shameful. I cannot stress enough that local farmers must obtain bank loans ahead of the upcoming planting season, so the urgency of getting a bill passed in both chambers and sent to the President cannot be overstated. We do not have time for political games aimed at undermining our President. Madam Speaker, agriculture is the #1 industry in Georgia and in the 12th District of Georgia. I know this process has been more challenging than many of our farmers could imagine. And I just want to reiterate that I will always stand with rural America 100%. I will not stop working until the farmers of the 12th District of Georgia and across our great state get this disaster relief that they need and deserve. I'd like to thank Senators Perdue and Isaacson for leading the effort in the Senate, my colleagues Austin Scott, Sanford Bishop, and Neil Dunn, and others that you will hear from here tonight in the House, and all of my colleagues here this evening for the commitment to getting this done. It cannot wait any longer. And with that, I yield back.
Madam Speaker, I wish to thank Representative Allen for his words and his support. And next, I'd like to introduce and yield 2 minutes to one of the most senior and experienced representatives in the delegation from Florida, a man who's been a personal mentor to me and a great model, Representative Bilirakis.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that. Doctor, I will tell you this, you've been a great model for me, serving on the Energy and Commerce Committee. It's always good to go to the physician to hear firsthand what the patients need and want. So thank you for healing your constituents over the years and now serving them in the United States Congress. Mr. Speaker, I cannot stress enough the devastation that hurricanes over the last few years have inflicted the state of Florida, but all over the country, as you can see, Georgia, North Carolina, Texas, what have you. Folks, we need to come together. We need to come together and get this done for the American people. This should be a no-brainer. We've waited too long for this to happen. It needs to be a bipartisan bill out of the Senate. Get it on the floor of the House as soon as possible so we can help our constituents. One particular case, in the city of Tarpon Springs alone, Hurricane Irma exacerbated shallowing problems at its port. This puts at risk the livelihood of our marine and tourism business owners and impacts $250 million in yearly commerce a year. A remedy known as the Anclote River Dredging Project was set to be funded under the previously passed emergency supplemental bill. We were given assurances, but I understand we have a lot of disasters that need to be taken care of, but we need to take care of our constituents, and this is a good example. And we did this right. We have county matching funds, state matching funds that are at risk right now. The city has put up money. We've got to get this project through. The seafood industry is suffering. Commerce, the sponge industry is suffering because of the lack of dredging of this beautiful Anclote River. Unfortunately, the sheer number of areas in need of repair from disasters forced the already allocated funding to be moved to other projects, and I understand that. But these projects are important as well. We need to ensure projects like Anclote are quickly and adequately fixed after a hurricane or other disaster, and therefore I support the immediate consideration of a disaster supplemental bill. I thank my colleague Neil Dunn for this special order. He's doing an outstanding job. We got to get this done quickly for our constituents. Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I yield back.
Madam Speaker, I'd like to thank Representative Bilirakis for his leadership and for his personal generosity of his time spent on me. May I ask the Speaker how much time remains on the clock?
The gentleman has 11 minutes remaining.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, next I'd like to introduce the third and final representative from Nebraska, a good friend and a good friend in Nebraska. And thank you so very much for being here. I yield 2 minutes to Representative Adrian Smith.
Thank you, Congressman Dunn. I appreciate your taking this initiative to bring folks together to discuss, unfortunately, the need to address the disasters across America. Representing one of the most rural districts in America, we have a lot of natural resources, among them a lot of rivers, a lot of miles of river in Nebraska. And not so long ago, the conditions were such that the rivers flooded in the central and eastern part of Nebraska, and in the west, a blizzard hit with the bomb cyclone and created massive damage. The chunks of ice flowing down rivers actually took out a dam, probably the first dam to break due to ice flows and the chunks of ice. It's been tragic. There's been loss of human life, certainly the loss of livestock. Initial estimates are estimating about $400 million in infrastructure damage and another roughly $1 billion in damage to crops and livestock. I certainly appreciate the fact that President Trump moved quickly upon Governor Ricketts' request for the disaster declaration. We are working together among the Nebraska delegation, both senators, all 3 House members, to make sure that we articulate the needs of not only Nebraskans, but when you remove agriculture products, like is the case, ultimately consumers will likely be impacted. And this is something we should always keep in mind, because certainly everyone needs to eat, and when we lose the channels of supply of agriculture products, that is bound to increase the cost of food. And when you look at the storm, the bomb cyclone that hit, it probably couldn't have happened at a worse time of year, right in the middle of calving season. And so it's a devastating condition here. I do appreciate the fact that so many producers, I talked to one today, instead of a 30-minute commute for a drive to work, they have to go 95 miles one way to work because the bridge is out. And when one bridge is out in rural Nebraska, that it takes a few miles to make up for that. And but I think we are resilient, and ag operators are resilient, so they're looking up. But we are concerned that here in the next few weeks, in fact, there's another storm forecasted for later this week, where folks are bracing for perhaps even more damage, but hopefully we can get through this. So again, I appreciate this opportunity to share what the needs are in Nebraska, and I will be introducing legislation to extend a number of tax provisions often provided to disaster areas to cover this year's disasters. And so I hope we can offer that support to disasters from last year as well, since we are discussing this evening multiple disasters from last year and this year. So again, I appreciate this opportunity. I yield back.
Madam Speaker, I thank Representative Smith for his words, and also for it speaks to the disaster that what did happen in Nebraska, that all 3 representatives showed up there. Next, I'd like to introduce and yield 2 minutes to my good friend from Florida. We actually share more in common than most representatives because of the vagaries of redistricting. We ran in 2016 in 12 counties, the same counties, 12 same counties. And he was a great support, a great example, and actually cleared the way for me. So I just want to say that I'm deeply grateful for having Dr. Ted Yoho here.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I just want to compliment Dr. Dunn for doing an awesome job. Your leadership on this is well noticed and well taken by the people of your district and all of North Central Florida, and working together with the Georgia delegation and other states. You know, Florida is no stranger to hurricanes. You know, the year before we had Hurricane Irma that went through the whole state, bypassed the Panhandle, and this year in 2018 we had Michael that hit the Panhandle with virtually Category 5s. It was 2 miles short of Category 5s. And the estimated impact for Hurricane Michael, in fact, it was so severe, before I get into the impact, is we couldn't get a hold of Dr. Dunn. And so our office was very concerned about that, and we took a load with the Gilchrist County Sheriffs to go up there to take supplies up there looking for you. And we didn't know if you had survived because nobody had heard, and so we're thankful that you're here, and I know your constituents are. But the impact of this went from timber, cotton, cattle, peanuts, nursery, poultry, vegetables, other field crops, dairies, aquaculture, fruit crops, tree nuts, beekeepers, to mention a few. That's no structures. The estimated cost just in the Panhandle of Florida is $1.5 billion. We heard these other states talking about agriculture is their largest economic driver in that state, their largest industry. Florida is the 3rd largest state in the union with 22 million people. Agriculture is our 2nd largest industry. It's vital. You know, we look in the past, this is my 4th term in Congress, and I remember Hurricane Sandy came, hit the Northeast, relief got put out. You know, it got sent out. This is something that we need to come together as Americans. We send billions of dollars in foreign aid around the world. It's time for us to look internally, fix our problems here, because the expense of these storms They accumulate. They don't go away from one year to the next. And we're going into the next season, the next fire season. So this is something we need to work now to correct these things. And I appreciate the leadership of Dr. Dunn, and I yield back.
Thank you very much. Madam Speaker, let me say that I'm deeply indebted to Dr. Yoho. He actually did. Our telecommunications went down after a storm in a way that America has never seen. We lost cell phones, landlines. We lost police radios. We were literally talking to each other by ham radios and runners. And when Dr. Yoho could not raise me or my office staff, he literally mounted a rescue operation complete with food and supplies and took care of the east end of my district, and I will always be grateful to you for that. Thank you so much, Dr. Yoho. For my final guest, I would like to introduce the representative from South Georgia, another good friend and a neighbor. We don't quite abut districts, but we come pretty close, and I spend a lot of time in his neighborhood. You need to spend more time down on my beaches. I'd like to yield 2 minutes to Representative Buddy Carter of Georgia.
Well, thank you, and I thank the gentleman. I thank Dr. Dunn for the work that he has done, as well as my other colleagues, Representative Austin Scott, Representative Sanford Bishop, Representative Martha Roby. All of these fine legislators have worked diligently on this, and I just thank them for their efforts, as well as others. Madam Speaker, I have the honor and the privilege of representing the 1st Congressional District of Georgia. The 1st Congressional District of Georgia includes the entire coast of Georgia, over 100 miles of coastline. We have a lot to be thankful for, a lot to be proud of. 2 major seaports. We have 4 military installations, Moody Air Force Base, Kings Bay Naval Base. We have Fort Stewart. We have Hunter Army Airfield. We have the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center. We have 2 Coast Guard stations, one in Savannah, one in Brunswick. We have so much to be thankful for, but we also have a very strong agricultural community, particularly in the western portion of our district. It's very, very important. And Madam Chair, Madam Speaker, much of the state of Georgia is in need right now, and they can't wait any longer. In the 1st Congressional District of Georgia, over the past few years, we've had hurricanes. We had Hurricane Matthew, we had Hurricane Irma, we had Hurricane Michael. We've had fires. We had the West Mims fire. We've had freezes and harsh freezing conditions that have impacted our agriculture community. And these disasters have been detrimental to agriculture in Georgia, which, by the way, agriculture in Georgia is our largest industry. That's very important, and very important in 1st District. In fact, just to be specific, blueberries, which are one of the major, the leading fruit now in the state of Georgia. Blueberries alone make up a $1 billion industry. That's billion with a B. $1 billion industry. And those farmers are the backbones of their communities. With blueberry farmers in some areas, their portfolio are their crops make up 30% of the portfolios of banks. That is significant to these communities, and we simply cannot allow these farmers to continue going without this assistance. The banks are waiting for many of these farmers to repay their loans. They're waiting to, it's putting them in jeopardy of not being able to farm next year and putting entire rural economies at risk. When you put 30% of your portfolio at risk, you're putting your community at risk. Congressional inaction on this is absolutely unacceptable. The Senate's failure to pass disaster aid last week was one of the worst moments that I've experienced in Washington since I've come to Congress. These people need assistance, Madam Chair. They need assistance. We need to help them. The American farmer feeds the world. Georgia farmers are an integral part of this. Blueberries are an important crop in our district. Agriculture is the #1 industry in Georgia. It is time for us to respond to this. This is what we are to do as members of Congress. We cannot simply ignore this. It will not go away. We need these farmers. They need our help, and we need to respond. And I encourage all of my colleagues to support disaster aid. And I yield back.
Madam Speaker, I thank my good friend Representative Carter for his impassioned words, and obviously he's echoing thoughts that we've heard from the other speakers. Seldom has a special orders ever been so well subscribed. So many people came to speak. So many people moved and hurt by the disaster. It leaves me with very little time, actually, but I do want to say a couple of things. I want to reiterate that this is an unprecedented event for timber. Nobody's ever seen this much timber on the ground. 3 million acres of timber. Think what that does to the foresters, the loggers, and the sawmills, and the military. We have lost an Air Force base, probably $4 to $6 billion worth of damage to that. We will rebuild it. We will rebuild it, and it will be great. But we need help from Congress to do that. I had a Navy base in my district, $288 million in damage. I have a Coast Guard base in my district that's particularly sad. They have a single building standing. They were victims of the storm. They were first responders to the storm. They were not paid because they're in the Department of Homeland Security for a month. It's shameful. These are fine people in the Coast Guard. We have housing problems right now. We have 30% of the homes in my home county are uninhabitable. 50% of the commercial real estate is not usable. We have a special geography. We're 100 miles away from the next place where there's multifamily housing. We need housing on the ground in the affected areas. We're running. Well, I just want to thank, Madam Speaker, all the people who took the time to come and obviously tell our story, which is a sad story. And I certainly urge the Congress to come to our rescue. That picture, by the way, is not 6 months old. It's 2 weeks old.
Gentleman's time has expired.
Thank you.
Thank you.